Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Spring Talks at EHESS. My name is Anne-Lorraine Bujon, and I am the editor of a journal, a general interest journal called Esprit. And it is my great pleasure today to interview Hamit Bozarslan. Hamit is a historian, he is a political scientist, he is a specialist in the Middle East. And often when I introduce him, I cannot choose between these different disciplines because I think it is one of the defining characteristics of his work that it is very interdisciplinary. His research topics concern the history of contemporary Turkey, the Kurdish question, minority issues in the Middle East, and more generally, I would say the history and sociology of violence in the Middle East. Although this research can also encourage him to delve wider, as we will see today, and also focus on different countries. Hamit is a director of studies here at the EHESS, where he co-directed the Institute for the Study of Islam and Societies of the Muslim World until 2008. But I would like to mention also that Hamit Bozarslan is a member of the editorial board of different journals, Culture et Conflit and Critique Internationale, and of course, Revue Esprit, where we are very proud and grateful to count on his insights on politics and international relations. Our interview today will focus on Hamit's recent research on anti-democracies, starting with this book, L'antidémocratie au XXIe siècle, Iran, Russie, Turkey, which was published in 2021. But we will also expand our focus slightly to previous works and also to more recent books, including one on the war in Ukraine, which was published just recently in March 2023, also by CNRS Éditions. I will be asking Professor Bozarslan the first few questions for 45 minutes approximately, and then we can turn to you, our audience, for more questions if you have any, which you will have, no doubt. So, Hamit, I would like to start with a question on your intellectual trajectory. I mentioned earlier that your major works, as one can tell with a quick glance at the long list of publications in this book, your first major works related to the history of Turkey and the Kurdish questions. And from there, you expanded to focus on violence, political violence and conflict in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And it seems to me from a distance that this took you to maybe a more abstract, conceptual investigation into revolution in and of itself, the political phenomenon of revolution across different places and times. And I see that there were already bold comparisons there, for instance, in a collective work which you directed with your colleagues here, Gilles Bataillon, Christophe Jaffrelot, on revolutionary passions in Latin America, the Middle East, and India. And now then, all of this took you to this notion which you forge in this book of anti-democracy and a comparison between three countries or three political regimes, maybe, Iran, Russia, Turkey, which are not often taken together. They're more often seen as belonging to very different geographical, cultural areas. But here you bring this notion, anti-democracy, to these three countries because they seem related in that way. So may I ask you how this course took you, how you came upon maybe this notion of anti-democracy and how it relates to your earlier analyses of political violence, conflict, and revolutionary passions?
Thank you so much, Laurent, for this presentation and for this question. And it is always a pleasure to work with the review Esprit, which has a very long history. And this history is actually is also a history of fight against totalitarianism in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. Some figures like Claude Lefort, Pierre Hasner, or Paul Ricoeur have been very useful in the review of Esprit, and they introduced actually one of the main criticism of totalitarianism during these years. And thank you so much for your questions too. Actually, I will start with Turkey. Turkey had a very long and conflictful history in the 20th century. Just take the war, Great War, and after the Great War, the Armenian genocide. In the wake of the Great War, the Armenian genocide, the foundation of the Republic, the Kurdish issue, the repression against the Kurds, and all of a sudden, all this story was forgotten. In the 1960s, 1970s, the country has experienced a couple of military coups. We had the emergence, the rebirth of the Kurdish issue, but the existence of the Kurds has been denied. We had the very first work on the Armenian genocide, but the Armenian genocide, the very existence of the Armenian genocide has been denied. We started to have an Islamic contest, but the very existence of the Islamic opposition has been denied. And all these questions brought me to investigate, to try to find the answer to the following question: why this society is not aware of the history that it had. And at the very beginning, we thought that that was a kind of amnesia. The history has been very brutal. In the past, other societies, they have forgotten also their brutal stories. And the day the knowledge will be available, the society will awaken and try to have another future through the evaluation of its own past. And this knowledge became available in the 1970s and 1980s. A Turkish sociologist, Ismail Beşikçi, has widely worked on the Kurdish issue and has shown why the Kurdish issue has been a historical issue, that the Turkish regime has been a very repressive regime against the Kurds. 10 years later, that was a Turkish historian, once again a Turkish historian, Taner Akçam, who has shown that the Armenian genocide was a historical reality. And we have started to have a lot of work on both the Kurds and the Armenians and the other communities, the Jews, the Greeks, and the Alevis in Turkey. And this knowledge did not change necessarily the power relations. On the contrary, we have had a further radicalization, a further brutalization of power against these communities, but also against the community of academics, against the community of scholars, against the community of the lawyers, against the community of journalists, whatever you can imagine. And knowledge was available, but the register of discourse has changed. The new registers of discourse was actually the past registers of discourse, and this registers of discourse was the Turks had a historical mission to accomplish, and this historical mission has been interrupted because there was the external enmities and the internal betrayal, and this historical mission allows the Turks to impose themselves almost as an organic biological community entity, and whatever opposed to this historical mission could be destroyed, if necessarily biologically. A return back of social Darwinism that was almost the dominant ideology of the Committee on Human Progress in the beginning of the century. The Committee on Human Progress was the committee that has organized the Armenian genocide. So I think that this reminding this past. It's very important also to understand the other fields of research that I have started to investigate. One of the questions is, of course, is social Darwinism. The fact that the nations, the communities, the societies, they constitute not the components of one single universal human kind, but they are species. And as in the Darwinian world, the species, they are in fight against each other, and there is no space for the survival of the all species, and only the species that are biologically masters of the world and are biologically strengthened, biologically organized, can survive to this struggle of to this war for struggle. And this ideology was absolutely dominant between 1870 and 1945 in Europe, but also in worldwide. This idea that some communities, they have an ontology, and that this ontology is an absolutely pure, immaculate ontology, but that this ontology is threatened by other ontologies, by corrupted and corrupting ontologies. This idea was also there between 1870 and 1945. The idea that the past history, the visible history, is a history of betrayal, and that the history of future must be a history of the revenge against the past, but also against the corrupted one, the corrupted elements, the cells, corrupted cells of one's own nation was there. So from that point of view, I try to understand the world history of the 20th century, and at the same time to try to understand why the revolutionary expectations that could be to some extent very progressive, very positive expectations did not last so much, or why they did lead to the formation of some dictatorship. And the last point that I want to understand or underline is that at the beginning, you have asked the question why bringing Iran, Turkey, and Russia together. Why? I think that to answer to this question, I will return back maybe to the 1910s, 1920s, the emergence of the fascist movements, the totalitarianism, this dominant ideology of social Darwinism. And 100 later, we see not exactly the same phenomena, but in the 2010s, I observed that in the three countries, we had the formation of quite similar regimes, and that these quite similar regimes, they mobilize a vocabulary, a syntax, a political syntax that was actually dominant, present and dominant in the 1920s and 1930s. The idea of historical mission, the idea of a Führer principe, it means that the leader incarnates the nation in its past and its future. The idea of ontological purity, the idea of war as a biological necessity, the idea of war as constitutive element of history, but also of life, the idea that spices and spaces have to juxtapose, overlap to each other, that, for instance, the Turkish nation or the Russian nation has the right to dominate a space because it is the dominant element and structuring and dominant element of the Russian space or the Turkish space or the Ottoman space. All this brought me to try to compare them between themselves, but also try to understand their genealogy, and this genealogy going back to the 1920s and 1930s.
Okay, thank you very much for this first overview, which I think anticipates on some of the questions I wanted to ask, but it's great because I will ask you to repeat yourself so we make sure that we understand the subtlety of this analysis. Maybe before we go back to the defining characteristics of these political regimes, I would like to ask you, and maybe this is the journalist in me speaking, about your research method and the material you use to write this book, Anti-Democracy in the 21st Century. And I think it's quite similar also in your book on Ukraine. So I have heard you before in some of our conversations mention the phrase coined by Raymond Aron, that he was a journalist philosopher. And you say you have a liking for this approach, although you do not see yourself as a philosopher or a journalist, but still you find intriguing this approach of the journalist philosopher. And here in this book, you mentioned that you collected a variety of material in the papers, in different books, of course, in social science books, but you chose to focus on speeches and the text of political discourse. Could you explain what this corresponds to in the way you work?
Yes, actually, I decided when I wrote this book, and that was the very first time that I applied this methodology to develop a new discourse analysis. We have a lot of discourse analysis, and in many discourse analysis, we have a kind of autonomy of discourse. Discourse is considered as reflecting the power relations, reflecting a historical context, changing historical context, but at the same time exerting some kind of autonomy and some kind of eclecticism too, because it will be absolutely impossible to understand a discourse, the formation of a discourse, without taking into account the link between this discourse and a general episteme, as Michel Foucault explained, and this discourse and other discourses. But in the case of this book, I decided to change a little bit the optic and to develop a new methodology. And this methodology was the methodology of saturation. So I analyzed a lot of discourses to the point of saturation. And at that point of saturation, I tried to understand what survived and what gained coherence independently on any kind of event, or independently of any kind of historical, let's say, circumstances. And in the three cases, the case of Iran, Turkey, and Russia, it is very interesting to see that you have an initial cognitive stock. And in this cognitive stock, which has been in the 1960s and 1970s, but which inspires itself from the themes coming from the 1910s, 1920s. So in this cognitive stock, you have a general overview of the world history, the one and the world as a whole. And the world history is interpreted as the history of the war against one's own nation. Just to give an example, in the Turkish discourse, you will never read the official Turkish discourse, of course, you will never read that the First World War, the Great War, was a European war. That the Great War was the outcome of nationalist passions in the European continent. The Great War is presented as the war of Europe against the Ottoman Empire, aiming at the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. Similarly, when you see Putin's discourse, that's very clear. The war, the history of the world, is the history of the global West against the Russian Empire. So this cognitive stock is not constantly used. You might have pragmatical steps, you might have processes of negotiation with the Western countries, with the Armenians, with the Kurds, with the Chechens, with the Ukrainians, whatever you can imagine. But at any moment of crisis, this cognitive stock, this initial discursive register will be mobilized and will be radicalized. At any moment when these leaders think that Kairos is there, the god of opportunity, and that the opportunate moment is there, and this opportunate moment should be used in order to destroy what Kronos, god of history, has created. In this case, this initial cognitive stock will be used, this initial discursive register will be used, and the leader will decide that the moment is there, we can go and we can declare a new war. So that's one of the points that I understand when I said the point of saturation. So reading Erdogan, reading Putin throughout 20 years, 25 years, and at the same time to see what survived, what is coherent in their discourse. As I said, beyond any historical or conjectural circumstances. There was also a second point that I decided to do in this discourse analysis. I tried to analyze the discourse and practices together. As I said, usually when we are in the discourse analysis, we give a kind of autonomy to discourse. When Macron speaks, when Tony Blair speaks, whoever speaks, we know that this discourse is oriented to the public opinion, to the international community, to one's own political party, whatever you can imagine. But we know that the political discourse will not be applied. The political discourse is not a practical tool, at least not immediately. But in the case of these three anti-democracies, the political discourse is a weapon. And we know that when this discourse will be pronounced, speech will be delivered, it will be immediately followed by a practice, and this practice is often either a war practice or a practice of internal repression. And from that point of view, that's very interesting to see in a very comparative perspective the history of 20 or 30 last years of these countries. That's why I prepared a very long chronology. A chronology for me is absolutely decisive. The chronology is not reminding the historical landmarks. The chronology for me is really heuristic, and a chronology, a cross-cut chronology, allow you to see this kind of switching from the discourse to the practice and the parallels between these three discourses.
So speech as action. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we'll go back to the chronology, and especially because I would like to go back in time. You mentioned already the 1910-1920 period and what came about then. And I'd like also to spend a moment on decades going from 1970 to 1990 maybe. But before we do that, I would like to start by a photo of the three political regimes as they stand today, and ask you to identify for us again, because you started doing it already, what you see as their defining characteristics, why you call them anti-democracies. So you listed some of these features already, I think. The vision of world history as a history of war on one's own nation, but also this idea of a historical mission for the nation to be carried out. But so there are other characteristics, I think, which you point out in your book. So if you could identify the ones that are most striking to you and brought you to compare these three countries, and maybe as a additional question, does this make them into an ideal type, as Max Weber would say, or a sort of anti-model that we should be wary of, or is this not a vocabulary that you would use for this notion of anti-democracy?
Actually, I would say that if you have to take an ultimate ideal type, that will be China. And
so that was another question, which is why China is not in the list.
But
which is
China is not in the
enlightening.
List, but yes. Maybe you can come back to this issue
sure.
later on. But if I have to define this anti-democracy, I will give the floor to Erdogan, to Khamenei, the Führer, the guide of revolution in Iran, and to Putin. What do they say? They say that the liberal democracy is a Western democracy. So there is a kind of global West, global Occidental bloc. And this liberal democracy is a cosmopolitan democracy, is a corrupted democracy, is a democracy that has lost any kind of virility. And this notion of the masculinity is a notion that is repeated again and again and again. And against this liberal, cosmopolitan, fragmented, and alienated and effeminated democracies, we represent our democracies, because in the two countries of three they present themselves as democracies, but as national and territorialized, nationalized democracies that are strongly linked to a history and non-alienated history, or at least the leader who incarnates the nation himself is inalienated and is the warrant of the inalienation of the nation. And this nation remain for the three leaders a nation which is masculine, which as masculine nation has an organic link with the war. The war is considered as not only a part of the historical mission, not only as a producer of history, not only as asked and legitimized by God. In the three cases, there is an eschatological legitimization of the war, but the war is also one of the features of the masculinity and therefore of the nation itself. So I said all these elements, they are very, very openly, frankly expressed by these leaders. So that these leaders that present themselves as the opponent of the liberal democracy. And that will be maybe one of the elements that I will take into account. The second idea is the historical mission. As I already insisted on this fact, that the nation, the Turkish nation, Iranian or Persian nation, or Russian nation has a historical mission. And this historical mission is to become either the dominant or the structuring element of the universum. The idea of dominating the universum is not supposed to be an idea of oppressing the other communities, but bringing them justice, bringing them the idea of the statehood, bringing them the idea of administration, of law, and of harmony. But in order to create these conditions, the dominant nation has to remain a dominant nation. The dominant nation, which creates an empire, which creates a broad entity, cannot dissolve, should not dissolve itself within this entity. Has to remain as the dominant aristocratic element of this empire and or this entity. And when you take Hitler's discourse, actually we have quite a similar fact. Hitler's aim was not to destroy the Western Europe, but to transform the German nation into the aristocratic dominant element of Europe. So the history has charged the Turks, the Russians, the Iranians or Persians by the accomplishment of this historical mission. But this historical mission has also been certified by the nature, and in three cases there is a massive risk of massive use of the natural arguments. In any case, the natural history is that. And the third element that intervenes is that this historical mission is also certified by God himself. So you have the history, which is metaphysical, you have the nature, which is scientific, and you have God, which is eschatological. And when you combine the three, this historical mission inevitably becomes a sacralized historical mission. And whoever opposes himself or herself to this historical mission will immediately become either an enemy, external, if he is external, or a betrayal. And the idea that the Russian elite, the Iranian elite, the Turkish elite has betrayed the nation in the 19th century through its processes of westernization is clearly defined as a sin, a historical sin, and the nation has to return back to its ontological purity of the origins in order to win again enough power, enough strength in order to dominate the world. And all these ideas, they are something that's quite odd in our political culture today, in our political syntax, but they are widely spread in the three countries. And I said one of the elements that the interviews also, which is very important, is the idea that the nation is the exclusive source of legitimation, but this legitimacy is delegated, entirely delegated to one single leader. So the nation cannot exist without being incarnated. The idea that the nation is inevitably incarnated, and that the leader that incarnates this nation is not the representative of the nation in the present time for a limited period of, let's say, 5 years, 10 years, or whatever you can imagine, but that he incarnates the nation in its past and in its future. When the Kremlin apparatus says no Putin, no Russia, I think that we should take it very seriously. They do not mean it symbolically. They do not mean as metaphorically, as a metaphor, but they really mean it.
He's merged with his, Putin has merged with the nation. So thank you very much. I think we get a much better sense now of how this unfolds and how it fits together, because the different features, of course, are coherent. And so maybe to add to that, if I ask now why China is not in the list, because China, I think, in some of the things you have described, we could recognize features of modern day China. But you also say that China is different, and I think it's in its relation to the past and to its past in the 20th century. But could you say why China? Tell us why China is not in the list.
Why China is not in the list, actually,
and works as a kind of counterpoint.
And I would say that definitely, if we had to have an ideal type of anti-democracy, that will be China. Also, the Chinese regime is, in my reading, in a very deep crisis, and this deep crisis is not a circumstantial crisis. But that's another point. Why China is not in the book? I think that for this, that was maybe 2 or 3 reasons. The first one was that I was maybe too much ignorant during this period when I prepared this book. I read a lot on China, but that was not enough. And I think that I started to read massively on China after having written this book, and particularly when we have prepared this special issue of the Revue Esprit on China, the colors of China.
In 2020, December 2020.
December 2020, in the wake of the coronavirus crisis. Because during the coronavirus crisis, I think that the only model that the world, the entire civilized world, has adopted, that was the Chinese model. So that was one of the reasons. But there is another reason, which is, I think, still very pertinent and which is very important, is that China says that she is in peace with her past. Why she is in her past, with her past? Because China, the Chinese leader, the Chinese historiography, they explain very clearly that the Chinese history was a great history, that the Chinese society does not need to be nihilistic and throw away her history. This history has been a history of brutalization, of humiliation. The 18th century, 19th century, particularly the 19th century, what happened in 1900 in the Forbidden City in Peking, etc. But still, they explain that the Maoist revolution of 1949 has been the rebirth, the act of rebirth of the modern China. The past is past. That new China is there, and that this new China is not only able to assume the past glory of imperial China, 5,000 years of civilization, they say. So the 5,000 years of civilization is incarnated today in the new China. Mao is glorified. Everyone knows that the Maoist regime was a very brutal regime, that between 1961 and let's say 68, throughout political brutalization. At least 40 million people died. We know that Xi Jinping's father has been arrested. We know that Xi Jinping's sister has committed suicide during this period of repression. But still, they can say we are not anymore in war with our own history, because our own the guilt and the humiliation of our own history, they have been washed out. So we can start again, and we can be in peace with our own history. That's not the case, neither in Iran, nor in Turkey, nor in Russia. In the three countries, the past seems to be still there. The past seems to still require a kind of revenge. The past still seems to be the marker of external enmity, but particularly of the internal betrayal. The past seems to be there as a sign of alienation. And in the three cases, the future is envisioned as the moment of the revenge over the past, which is not at all anymore the case in China.
Which is, so China would be embracing its future because in a sense it's triumphant.
It is triumphant and in peace with her own revolution. Putin cannot be in peace with 1917. And when you see, for instance, the discourse of Putin, February 21st, 2022, which was the discourse that prepared the aggression against Ukraine, this is a very long discourse, 15 pages. And in these 15 pages, in this text of 15 pages, the argument of the NATO trying to invade Russia intervenes only at page 9. And before this page 9, what he accuses Lenin, because the betrayal is the betrayal of Lenin. He accuses Gorbachev because the betrayal is the betrayal of the perestroika period. So we are guilty, he says. And the war of Ukraine is a way of paying for the sins that the Russian elite has itself committed against the Russian history. You don't have any more that kind of discourse in China.
Thank you. So this is I think key to understanding your argument. This idea of a revenge on the past, that there have been failures because of betrayals. And so there's this impression of going round in circles. So I think this is a very good transition to my next question, which is in the three countries, Iran, Russia, Turkey, you point out that this development into full-blown anti-democracies is something that happens, say, in the early 21st century, and obviously from 2010 to today. So that's the present day situation. But you also focus in some of the chapters on what I would describe as a kind of prehistory of anti-democracy, and maybe there's a prehistory. So there's this discourse of the 1910, 1920s, the social Darwinism you mentioned, the nationalistic discourse, and maybe also fascism simply. But what you describe is that in the 70s, if I understood you correctly, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, maybe Iran is slightly different, I don't know, but although on the surface, not much had changed in these regimes, there was already a whole intellectual and cultural community that was veering to the right, and holding these views and going back maybe to these versions of nationalists, maybe even fascist discourse, and that held sway. So they were actually radicalizing beneath the surface, and that's what explains where we are today, in a sense. Did I understand correctly?
I think that you understood absolutely correctly, and you went well beyond what I could explain in this book. I think that 1960s and 1970s are absolutely important, crucial years, probably not only for these three countries, but for many other places. And what is very strange, what is very odd, is that many scholars work on the left-wing movements during this period, and you mentioned the revolutionary passions that we have prepared with Jacques Rouleau and Bataillon on India, Middle East, and Latin America. And in this book too, actually, we have insisted mainly on the left-wing movements. But during this period, actually, the right-wing movements, they were quite marginal. They were quite marginalized too. They lost the symbolic battle with the left. The left was the dominant discourse, but these movements, they were there. They were there not only at the organizational level, but they were also there as political discourses. They were there as political syntaxes. And I will take just three cases. Solzhenitsyn, of course, one of the most important writers of the 20th century. I think that without Solzhenitsyn, we could not have this insight, in-depth sight of what happened in the Gulag concentration camp in Russia. We would not have the image of what the Stalinism was exactly in Soviet Union. And at the same time, when after his Nobel Prize, when Solzhenitsyn takes floor in 1978 in one of American universities, his discourse is not about Soviet Union. His discourse is about the Western bloc, and the West is corrupted. The idea that the Russian corruption itself is linked to the Western corruption, and that the cosmopolitan world, that the liberal world is a corrupted world, appears clearly in Solzhenitsyn's discourses. And during these years, we know that there is a massive repression of the intelligentsia, Soviet intelligentsia, and at the same time, in some Soviet periodicals, you see the emergence of anti-Semitic and right-wing elements. In Iran, you have a very strong radical left-wing movement, and everyone thinks that Iran will be the next country in the world on the world map to experience a left-wing movement, revolution. And actually, the 1978-79 Iranian revolution starts as a left-wing contest.
And there's a lot of enthusiasm here. For instance, in our journal, we have one or two papers that are
because the last issue of the journal Esprit is on Iran. But at the same time, when you see in the 1960s and 1970s, a figure like Ali Shariati, who has corresponded with Fanon, Frantz Fanon, who knew very well the French authors like Albert Camus, like Jean-Paul Sartre, he simply Islamized Marxism. And he totally perverted the theory of alienation of Marx, saying that the nation as an Islamic nation is alienated, and the fight against alienation will go through the coming back to the original ontological purity of pre-Westernized period of the Iranian nation. And in Turkey, during this period, you have a book called The Ideal of the World Domination of the Turks, written by Osman Turan, a professor. World Domination of the Turks. That's a 500-page book. I think that everything is said. So I think a lot of things they find their origins in the 1960s and 1970s, and you are absolutely right, because I think that when you make a genealogy, you see that periodically these themes, they were there since the end of 19th century. But what is very important is that at each period, these ideas are radicalized. You do not only inherit the ideas, but when you inherit them in a very practical way, and you radicalize them either at an organizational level or as a state policy. And don't forget that you are Putin or you are Erdogan. I think that Erdogan signs 35,000 files a week, because all power is concentrated in his hand. He will not read books, and he will not make be a part of the hermeneutical discussion on the Turkish nation. He will simplify extremely simplify what he has intellectually inherited through the use of violence. And violence is a kind of simplifier. That's the case of the jihadist violence. That's the case of Putinist violence or war practice. That's the case of the repression in Iran. That's the case also the repression in Turkey and the war practice of Turkey.
So that these ideas are inherited, radicalized, put into action, and turned into violence. So thank you. The process is becoming clearer and clearer. My next question would be about the conflict in Ukraine and how it sort of vindicates, verifies some of your arguments here. Since this book, L'Antidémocratie au XXIe siècle, came out, you published two more. One called Le Temps des Monstres, which was a collection of articles on different protest movements that shook the Middle East since 2011 and Mediterranean. And the second one on the unfolding conflict in Ukraine, which you wrote as the conflict was unfolding. So I think the war in Ukraine does work to illustrate a number of the points that you make here, and for instance, taking ideas and turning them into violence. Could you tell us how this plays out for you in Ukraine and in Russia, obviously today, but maybe also Iran and Turkey, and how they have positioned themselves since the war in Ukraine begun?
What is very important, and in this book on anti-democracies, I quote Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin is one of the main ideologists of Putinism, or at least he was. Maybe he is not anymore so popular. And Alexander Dugin explained very clearly that Ukraine should be reduced into a folkloric entity. What does it mean, a folkloric entity? It means an Ukraine without Kharkiv, without Kiev, an Ukraine composed only of 4 or 5 supposedly Catholic provinces. And when you have said that, and Putin has insisted on the fact that Ukraine was, of course, Russia, that the Russian Empire has been founded in Ukraine, and that the Ukraine as a space could but be a Russian space, and that at any cost this will be realized. So for many of us, actually, the timing of the war, the scale of the war, all this, we couldn't anticipate on these facts. But the war, the fact that one day or another there will be a new military step, it doesn't surprise us. And I think that that's another point which is very important, is that the war with Ukraine for Putinism is a civil war. Actually, not exactly a civil war. When he uses the concept of the special operation, military operation, I think that for him is simply a case of police operation, nothing more. Of course, he couldn't expect such a resistance, but for him, in the sense that Ukraine is not a state, Ukraine is not a Westphalian entity, Ukraine is not an entity that has been accepted by the international community in his eyes, but just a Russian territory, territory that usurpates the name of the state. For him, that was very obvious that that could not be a war with Ukraine, that could be only and only a special operation within Ukraine. But there is also another civil dimension, which is very important, that this war has been used in order to suppress massively the opposition. Putin explained that already in March 2023, saying that those who oppose to the war, they are simply the flies that happen to enter in one's mouth, and that these flies have to be crushed down. From that point of view, I think that that's very clear that Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, has offered to Putin Putinism the opportunity of suppressing this opposition. But at the same time, in this book, I conclude by saying that there are spaces of resistance in the three countries. These spaces of resistance, they are very innovative spaces. They are the civic spaces, but they are also the spaces of solidarity. They are the spaces of inventing meaning. They are the spaces of preserving cognitive faculties of the societies. They are the spaces of the future. And we see today in Russia, these spaces, they have not disappeared. These spaces are quite active, still quite active in spite of the repression, as they are in Turkey or in Iran. And concerning your question, what is the position of Turkey and Iran? I think that one can see very clearly that there is an alliance between Iran and Russia. Iran offers a lot of opportunities to Russia, selling namely the drones to Russia, because the Russian army is in a very bad shape. And they badly need weaponry from outside, and Iran is one of the suppliers. And concerning Turkey, Turkey is officially neutral. Turkey is officially defending the integrity, territorial integrity of Ukraine. But at the same time, we see that Erdogan and Putin, they do share exactly the same worldview, and Turkey has become the backyard of Putinism today in the Middle East. The sanctions they have, they are not respected or accepted by the Turkish companies and the Turkish government. Many oligarchs, they are in Turkey, so Turkey became a kind of a backyard for Putinism in the region.
Thank you very much. So just a brief footnote to say also that one of the things you point out in this book is how these regimes have all turned into kleptocracies. And obviously this is also visible at the moment with the war in Ukraine, and also how they have to buy violence from mercenaries because they cannot mobilize it, which is again something I think that we have seen at play become very visible with the Wagner group in the Ukrainian conflict. So I will ask one last question before we turn to the audience, which is I would like to insist, and this is something that you have mentioned already, and you started there, so this will bring us back, I think, to where you started. You say in this book that anti-democracies pose a question or several questions to democracies, and this is why it's important to name them that way, maybe rather than just dictatorships. Or there's a question in these developments for us citizens of Western liberal, corrupt, effeminate, cosmopolitan democracies. And you insist, I think, throughout your research, your thinking, and these books, that history is open-ended, obviously, and contrary to what the dictators would like their people to think, that none of this was necessarily preordained, that there's no fatality. And I think you also insist on this connection of knowledge to power. Finding meaning in what is going on is a way of resisting. It is a way of ensuring that history can have other outcomes, so that we always need to function, I think, both as subjects capable of critical judgment and citizens bearing a kind of responsibility for the future also. So could you tell us, where is our responsibility in the current situation?
I think that our responsibility is that we didn't take into consideration what they said. The clear, naked speech, discourse that has been always accompanied by pure violence has not been taken seriously in the Western countries, or the democracies, I would say. Just take the case of Ukraine. As I said, the Putinist discourse insisted again and again and again that Ukraine didn't exist, that Ukraine was an internal Russian affair. And they have given the proof, 2014. the annexation of Crimea, and the beginning of the war in the Donbass. And the beginning of the war in the Donbass was simply because there were already the Russian troops. And nothing has been done from 2008, from 2014, 2000 to 2022. Let's say, leave aside any other kind of registers, just in the register of energetic dependence on Russia. The European countries didn't try to find an alternative to the dependence on Russia in the field of energy, while we knew that the war practice of Russia was there. And that's not the first case, of course. The first time in the world history, there is a kind of provincialization of the entire non-democratic world. And as the democracies had no responsibility, whatever, vis-à-vis the other part of the world where there is a fight for democracy going on. That's not the first time. As I said, during the, I will just remind the case of the Spanish Civil War, which started in 1936, which lasted until 1939. France and Great Britain, which were the main democracies of Europe during this period, they decided not to intervene, to remain neutral, but Mussolini's Italy and the Nazi Germany, they have intervened and they destroyed the Spanish democracy and the Spanish Republic. So this provincialization of what is not democratic is a quite problematic issue for the democracies. And I said there is, and I can multiply the other cases. There are a lot of cases. And I think that one of the main problems also that our democracies have is that they have lost their attractivity. I think that as models, they are not attractive anymore. They are weak. The weakness of democracy is the condition of the existence of democracy. I don't think at all that the democracies should destroy their fragilities, their fragmentation, their internal oppositions, because a democracy that has destroyed any kind of internal fragility will not resist to the temptation of authoritarianism. But at the same time, this fragmentation, fragilization has to be counterbalanced by some notion of the power, some notion of the might, some notion of the capacity of intervening, capacity of changing, intervening in the world stage, and this capacity of intervening is not necessarily exclusively military. It can be military, but not exclusively military. From that point of view, I would say that our democracies, which are in crisis, which have lost their own trust in their own existence and on their own future, have lost their attractivity, and that's quite problematic.
Thank you very much. Maybe we have questions from our audience. So I will read the question. Not everyone can see the questions, I guess. Huh? So this is our first question. Thank you for this amazing talk. I agree with this part of the question. On the eve of Turkish elections, how do you see the mobilization of this kind of anti-democratic discourse you have described? Question from Erica Gonzalez.
Thank you so much. It's very difficult to answer to this question because I think that what we see in Turkey today is a kind of, the power is exhausted. The power has no more energy. The capacity of proposing and mobilizing discourse has been widely eroded. For many reasons, but because also the economic situation is quite dramatic, and Erdogan is in power since 20 years, and he still promises glorious days to come, but these glorious days do not come since 20 years. The criminalization of the opposition, the stigmatization of the opposition, all that do not pay so much. But at the same time, we see also that the opposition do not propose, except the Kurdish and left-wing opposition, a democratic alternative or at least a democratic discourse, because they are the official opposition, the mainstream opposition is very afraid that if they question Erdogan's position on the Kurdish issue, they will lose their conservative basis. So we are there. There is a kind of non-debated electoral process going on. There is no debate, a kind of sterile scene of discussion. But what is very interesting is that the Turkish elections do not create so much enthusiasm elsewhere, not either. In the European countries, sometimes we see short news on Turkey, what will happen if Erdogan loses the elections, what is the situation. But my impression is that there is a form of, there is an internalized vision that some countries will remain authoritarian, no more other perspectives for these countries, and we have to coexist with these authoritarian regimes. And please do not provoke these authoritarian regimes. Try to be appeasant with these authoritarian regimes. We have to try to diminish their power of annoyance. That's the only thing that we can do. That kind of discourses are also available, also used for Turkey.
So I have, maybe, do we have other questions? So I have one because of what you just said. It brings to mind, obviously, the situation with China and the current discourse on China, that we should be aware of not provoking China or not burning our bridges with China. So can I ask you about that, our current attitudes towards China and those of our leaders at the moment?
I am very much worried about this, of course, because saying that Europe cannot count on the United States is one thing. And I think that we saw that during the Trump administration. I don't know what will happen in the United States in 2024. Probably a returning back of Trump is not, it doesn't seem to be so obvious, but in the Republican Party, you have a quite pro-Russian tradition also, so that Europe has to imagine herself as an entity, a political, economical, and military entity. I can understand that. But saying that that's because we cannot be a part of the game of the two blocks is something quite unbelievable. Because for me, the game is not between the blocks. What is at stake is the fight between democracy and anti-democracy. And do not, having this in mind, saying that all this about geostrategy and geopolitics is something quite amazing and which is quite dangerous too. It means that if everything is geopolitical and geostrategical, tomorrow we will also accept the Russian domination in Eastern Europe. Tomorrow we will accept the annexation of Taiwan, forced annexation, not willingly, an annexation through referendum of the through Taiwanese will is another point. But forced annexation. So it means that if we accept this logic, this preeminence of the geopolitical and geostrategical reason, that in this case we will be able to, we will be ready to accept anything in the world history or world scene. That's from that point of view, I think that it's quite dangerous. I think that it is important more than ever to say that what's going on in the world history today, in the world scene today, is not between the East and the Western countries, blocks. We are not in that kind of configuration. And between 1936 and 1939, we were not in a fight between the East and Western bloc in Spain. The fight was about democracy. The struggle was about democracy. And today, what we observe in Ukraine, what we observe in Chinese policy vis-à-vis Taiwan, what we observe in the Chinese discourses vis-à-vis her Asian environment is directly linked for me to the question of democracy and anti-democracy, and we have to be aware of that.
So with this, I think, very strong idea that some of the spaces of resistance or claiming democracy or believing faith in democracy comes from parts of the world that we are more used to seeing as undemocratic. But this is where resistance is happening. This is where people are fighting for democracy.
And they pay the price. I mean, the Chinese Nobel Prize, Liu Xiaobi, he has died in the jail. Alexei Navalny is today in a camp. Osman Kavala in Turkey and Selahattin Demirtas, they are in jail, in prison, as the special guest of Erdogan since very long time, very years. We see what happens in Iran.
Yeah,
so, because saying that here in these countries that these societies they are condemned to be under the authoritarian regime means also missing any kind of respect and sympathy for these people who struggle for democracy as well.
Thank you very much. If we have no other questions, can I ask one last tiny question? Is there a new book that you are working on?
Yes, there is a new book, but that will be for 2026.
Okay.
And that will be on the right-wing revolutions in the 19th century.
The right-wing revolution in 1920. Perfect. So we're going back in time this time. Thank you very much, Hamit Bozarslan. And goodbye.